Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman. How's it going, Pat?
It's going great, Len. Good to see
Good.
you.
Nice to see you too. Well, we have a special guest today who is, Wyatt Reed is an editor at the Grayzone, an independent news site. He's also something very rare in investigative journalism these days, and that is a foreign correspondent who just spent, I think, about a week in Iran and is currently in Beirut, Lebanon. And we want to obviously talk to you about your trip to Iran, but let's start with the situation in Lebanon. Trump has announced another possible deal to resolve the war in Iran, which seems to have completely disintegrated, just like the other announcements. And one of the big issues is that one of Iran's conditions is that Israel stops bombing Lebanon and attempting to occupy Lebanon, which appears, from everything that I've seen, Israel has no intention of stopping bombing Lebanon. We had a ceasefire that's been in effect supposedly since April 17th, but the reports that we're hearing here in the States is that Israel continues to strike Lebanon, southern Lebanon. There's mass displacement, entire villages being blown up, journalists and medics being blown up. So what are you seeing there in Beirut? What can you tell us?
Absolutely. Well, in terms of the ceasefire in Lebanon, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. Israel violated the ceasefire immediately. It's been violating the ceasefire every single day, which has unsurprisingly led to reprisals by Hezbollah, by these resistance forces in the south, which are targeting Israeli forces with drone strikes that have been absolutely devastating for the Israeli forces. They just struck probably their highest profile target yet. Colonel, the head of a colonel named Meir Biederman, the commander of the 401st Armored Brigade, which is infamous in the West for being the detachment of the Israeli army, which killed a young Palestinian girl named Hind Rajab. So Biederman is reportedly in critical condition. I was actually able to speak to a senior Hezbollah official this week who told me that this was an intelligence coup, that this was a deliberate operation targeting this commander specifically. This Hezbollah official told me that they had been tracking his movements, which suggests a far more advanced intelligence apparatus than what we're led to believe regarding Hezbollah. So the war in Lebanon is really not going the way that the Israelis would want. And so far, the reaction to that appears to have been a decision to implement what they once referred to as the Dahia Doctrine, basically targeting civilian infrastructure and making people's lives unlivable. And that's being replicated every day across South Lebanon. They are striking hospitals, medical centers. Yesterday, they destroyed a paramedic headquarters, a rescue crew headquarters. They have been targeting high-profile journalists. They've been targeting medics. As I noted, a medic that I spoke with last Wednesday in southern Lebanon, as he was trying to pull bodies out of the rubble of a family of 9, which had been completely wiped out by an Israeli airstrike. I interviewed him Wednesday morning, and then Friday morning, I found out he had been killed by Israel. A very nice guy who's also a journalist. His name's Ahmed Hariri. And the footage of him being killed it went viral on social media because first, the Israeli forces struck a father and daughter Syrian refugees. And then when the paramedics came to rescue them, the Israelis struck them as well in a double tap strike and killed four of those paramedics. Three were killed instantly, and one of them died later at the hospital. So that has been kind of the MO of the Israeli forces that I've observed in my 2 weeks here in Lebanon. Just everyone is a target. And so, I've been wearing my press vest and my body armor and my helmet, but there's a part of me that thinks that this may actually make me more of a target, given the extreme hostility that's been shown to other journalists here. So, I'm not really sure what the suggestion would be in this case. I personally, I would rather have the protection than not have it, but it seems like it could be putting a little bit of a target on my back as well.
So Wyatt, you said that things aren't going the way that Israel would hope, or maybe what they want. What is it, in your view, that first of all, what does Israel say it wants from this invasion, and what do you think that what they say is correct, or is there another motivation for what they're doing?
Well, their stated war aim was the disarmament of Hezbollah. They've stated variously that I think at one point they said that they wanted to destroy Hezbollah, and then they said they want to disarm Hezbollah. Now they want to create what they call a buffer zone in South Lebanon up to what they call the Yellow Line. This could end up being basically all the way up to the Litani River. It's impossible to say exactly where that might end. But we've also seen people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, this extremely nationalist Israeli minister, who said quite openly that they want to establish permanent settlements in South Lebanon. So to me, the goal is what they call Greater Israel, and this is a Israeli ethno state, Jewish sort of supremacist ethno state, all the way. If the Israeli flag is any indication, the two blue lines on the Israeli flag represent the Euphrates River and the Nile River. So this would include presumably large swaths of not just Lebanon, but also big chunks of Syria, big chunks of Egypt potentially. So really, there's no knowing exactly how far they're willing to go, but the ultimate goal seems to be a much larger ethno-state than the current borders of Israel.
Wyatt, you recently interviewed a Hezbollah leader. I'm not sure if this has been released yet, but can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Lebanese people and Hezbollah? First of all, does Lebanon have an official army? What is their loyalty? Are they protecting the Lebanese people? And what is Hezbollah's role?
Yeah, it's a good question. Lebanon does have an army, and they have been, in many cases, targeted by the Israeli forces over just the past several months. This has happened on multiple occasions. There have been casualties incurred, but they do not respond. The Lebanese forces do not fire at Israeli forces, even those that are currently occupying Lebanese land. So the only force that does so is Hezbollah. And this has led to kind of an interesting dynamic in Lebanon where if you look at recent polling, you will find that a majority of Lebanese people support the long-term disarmament of Hezbollah. But a majority of Lebanese people do not support the disarmament of Hezbollah in the current context. They recognize that if Hezbollah were to unilaterally disarm, in this context, that would open the country up to Israeli occupation and to civil war. So people here have kind of a pragmatic view of things, where even those people who are not politically affiliated with Hezbollah, there's if you break down sort of the religious demographics, you'll find overwhelming support for Hezbollah among Shia Muslims, sort of tepid support among the Sunni Muslims, closer to 50-50. And then the country's Christian population has much lower support for Hezbollah. But people across all backgrounds generally do not support unilateral Hezbollah disarmament, because they recognize that the Lebanese armed forces would be incapable or unwilling to resist any kind of Israeli occupation. So in many ways, Hezbollah is the Lebanese armed forces. They have operated at times in conjunction with the Lebanese armed forces. In 2017, for example, when border towns like Arsal were taken over by ISIS, they basically held joint operations, Hezbollah and the Lebanese army, in order to liberate these towns. And Hezbollah, being a stronger military force, effectively took the lead in those operations. So there is currently been announced a plan. This has been pretty widely reported in Lebanese media, and I think to a certain extent this has also been reported on in English media. But the CIA backed a plan which would have seen the Lebanese army create a unit specifically dedicated to disarming Hezbollah. Something that, there are certainly quite a few high-level Trump administration officials or people in that orbit who have been proposing something like this for quite some time. But, this obviously doesn't have very much support, it seems, among the Lebanese army itself, which, despite having this complicated relationship with Hezbollah, there are many families in which one brother goes into the Lebanese armed forces and another brother goes into the resistance and fights with Hezbollah. And then they'll come back at the end of the day and they'll sit around the same dinner table. So it's a very, it's a complex, but there's a lot of overlap between them. And so any attempt to enforce this kind of Hezbollah disarmament, which is what Israel says that it's demanding in these kind of these negotiations that happened last week in Washington between Israel and between the Lebanese government. That was kind of the main Israeli ask, and the U.S. was happy to accommodate it. But in terms of whether anyone can actually make that happen, it doesn't seem very likely. It doesn't seem likely that the armed forces will be willing to enforce it, and then it doesn't seem likely that they would succeed. The only real possible outcome of something like that, I think, would be civil war. So that would suit Israel just fine. I think American interests would not be well served by that kind of thing. So that's where we are currently.
So what is Hezbollah like for our viewers who aren't involved in this in a daily basis? I've heard that name since probably the 1980s, but if you can just step way back and give just a high level overview, who are they? When did they start? Who funds them? And what do they want?
Yeah, Hezbollah describes themselves, well, in the U.S. view, they are a terrorist organization.
Well, that doesn't
The
mean
U.S.
anything.
government.
Everyone's a terrorist. If they don't agree with you these days, you're a terrorist. If somebody doesn't agree with you, they're a terrorist. That's how our government works, and that's certainly how many other governments work. They label everyone a terrorist. So that's meaningless. But we can talk about their actions, and that would define whether they're terrorists or not. But before we even get there, where did they come from? What are they trying to accomplish, and who's funding them?
Well, Hezbollah was created in the early 1980s. They were created as a response to Israeli occupation of Lebanon. And then, they've been the force that was able to kick out the Israeli occupation. So in the early 2000s, when Israel left Lebanon, it was because they came under continuous and basically they were unable to resist the continuous attacks by Hezbollah. They were
Do they
unable
are
to
they represent? Do
maintain
they
this
represent?
imperial sort of occupation.
Sorry,
Sorry?
do they represent a particular sect, or are they religious in nature? Or do they have a religious
Yes.
leadership, or
They
are they?
they are made up predominantly of Shia Muslims. They are strongly aligned with Iran. They see themselves as what's called the axis of resistance, and so they are kind of the Lebanese. In terms of the Lebanese domestic political scene, a lot of people, especially who kind of detractors, will say, "Oh, they're the Iranian arm," and they certainly do receive quite a bit of funding and assistance in a variety of arenas from the Iranians. So they are closely tied, but as I was told by Wafiq Safa, who is a senior Hezbollah official who I interviewed this week. He is a top security official with the party. He explained to me that they are closely tied to Iran, but they operate independently. So they don't ask permission from Iran to carry out their operations, but they see themselves as on the same team in a broader struggle against occupation, against Israel. Historically, the leader of Hezbollah, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed last year by a U.S. Israeli strike. He was killed while he was meeting with an IRGC general. He had a very famous analysis where he kind of identified the United States as the group's primary enemy, and he said that Israel was kind of an arm, an extension of U.S. imperialism in the region. And it seems to me as though their analysis has somewhat shifted. As was explained to me by Mr. Safa this week, they view the Trump administration as basically a Zionist lobbying front. They see the Trump administration as representing Israeli interests far more than representing American interests, which is an analysis that I think kind of holds up. It's pretty clear, for example, that the Iran war is not in the interests of the average American taxpayer, or really even the imperialists themselves. Even if you support American imperialism, it's pretty clear that this left the empire significantly weaker than when it started. So
I would
from
love to
that,
go there, but just to finish up, and I know, Len, I'm asking a lot of questions, but I just want to understand with Hezbollah. So it's a Shiite organization. It receives some of its funding from Iran. Is its goal to take over the Lebanese government? Does it hope someday to be the Lebanese government?
it doesn't view itself as it does have a political wing, right? So it has members of parliament, but I don't see as far as I'm aware, they have no intention of trying to dominate the country and impose themselves as its only rulers. They limit themselves to being basically response to Israel. So I think their goal more so is the end of Israel as a functionally Jewish supremacist state, and its replacement with something more democratic where Palestinians, Arabs are allowed to vote. That I think is more so their objective than running the day-to-day affairs of Lebanon. I think Lebanon is an interesting and very complicated country because it's made up of these different ethnic and religious groups who have been for 100 years have been varying extents vying for control of the country, of different sections of the country. But Hezbollah has never said that it wants to replace the other ethnic and religious groups. They view themselves as one segment of Lebanese society, and they certainly do speak for most Shia Muslims, but according to polling at least. But I don't think they see themselves as the would-be rulers of the entire country necessarily.
Why you indicate that Hezbollah was created in the early 80s to resist Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and now we're sort of in basically a repeat of that. I'm assuming that the Lebanese people don't want to be occupied, have part of its country occupied. And all it seems to me that's resisting the Israelis is Hezbollah. Am I wrong about that? Does the Lebanese army come to the aid of the Lebanese population and their villagers in southern Lebanon to protect them or to fight back?
No, the role that I've seen the Lebanese military play is generally they work. You see them in the city of Beirut. They're basically traffic cops. They stand around directing traffic. Um, their role in the South is largely collecting unexploded ordnance.
It
They
sounds
don't
a
do
little bit
any.
like, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but just because we had on Ali Abu Niba to talk about the situation in the West Bank, it sounds a little bit like the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That basically they don't have any jurisdiction to arrest Israeli settlers if they kill Palestinians. It sounds kind of like that's this a parallel situation. Is that a fair analogy with the Lebanese army?
Well, they are beholden to the Lebanese government, and the Lebanese government is very pro-United States. It's very pro-Western. Um, the fact that they are sitting down for negotiations at all with Israel kind of tells you everything. I mean, under Lebanese law, but according to the Lebanese constitution, it's illegal to do that. It's illegal for any Lebanese citizen to have contact with any Israeli citizen, let alone at a high level diplomatic engagement like that. So they represent a specific constituency. They're not terribly popular, I would say, but there's a reason that they're in power.
One more Hezbollah question, and then we'll move on. You said in the beginning that Israel considers them terrorists. Do they do what a man on the street would consider terrorist type operations? Is it suddenly blowing up things in the middle of a town or a square, and trying to cause fear and panic through violence against civilians? Is that their MO, or are they really an army that fights it?
They, I would describe them more as a guerrilla army. They have in the past, um, there was kind of the barracks bombing in the 80s that was attributed to them, in which a number of U.S. Marines were killed. That was probably their last kind of high profile terrorist incident, if you want to describe it that
Say
way.
what you will about that, but those were against uniformed military people. It wasn't against children in a public square, let's say. Do they do
No,
those sorts of things?
if that's occurred, I'm unaware of it. Their main targets are Israeli military objects. So if you pay much attention on social media, the most visible explanation, I guess I could give of what their operations consist of, or at least their most effective operations right now. They are, you can see them in these videos from these FPV drones. So you'll see footage from southern Lebanon where occupying Israeli forces that have crossed into Lebanese territory and established kind of forward operating bases are being basically picked off left and right by drone operators. Now, according to the latest figures I've heard from even Israeli sources, I think this was a few weeks ago, the estimation that they had was that they had taken out less than 10% of the drone teams belonging to Hezbollah, which would indicate that that's basically a drop in the bucket. And we don't know how many new teams Hezbollah is training all the time. Their target selection is ramping up. They're seeming to get more sophisticated in terms of their intelligence capacity. And they're not just hitting soldiers, they hit weaponry, they hit Iron Dome batteries. So this is military hardware that costs tens of millions of dollars or more in some cases, and it's being knocked out by drones that cost a few hundred or a few $1,000s. So the drones have really been a huge coup for Hezbollah in terms of kind of turning the tides in the battle of asymmetric warfare. That's something that so far the Israelis have shown that they don't have an answer for.
Before we move on from Hezbollah, I want you to address just a couple things since you're there in the country. First of all, what we hear in the U.S. media is that Israeli attacks in Lebanon always target Hezbollah. First of all, is that correct? And then the second thing I want you to address is just the state, the strength of Hezbollah. We also were led to believe that basically they were pretty much eliminated after the pager attacks. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that and what the current situation or the current fighting power is of Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, if they've been striking military targets, I haven't seen them.
What
What
are
I
they
have,
striking? What are they? What is Israel striking?
well, the most today, the big story was their attack on the Karaun Dam, which holds a huge reservoir of water in the north of Lebanon, and this was subject to an airstrike. There was no people visible in the video of the strike. I'm sure that if they've offered a defense, they would say that there was some kind of Hezbollah fighter in the vicinity. But when you're striking dams with the apparent intention of causing them to burst and then flood nearby towns, it's very clear that you're not targeting individuals. It's collective punishment. When you're attacking hospitals, at least 4 of which have been damaged by Israeli strikes in the war over the past, less than 2 months. At least 5 clinics have been damaged. There's been over 160 attacks on healthcare facilities and healthcare workers that have been documented. Multiple journalists who have been killed, including after broadcasting live from a building that had been targeted, furiously calling everyone they knew, and a woman named Amal Khalil is probably the most high-profile victim we've seen recently. I spoke with her brother, and her car, clearly marked press, was targeted by an Israeli strike. Her and her colleague fled the car, took refuge in a nearby building, and then that building was attacked for several hours while she live streamed from the location, while she made calls to everyone that she knew, while numerous people asked the Americans to intervene, the Israelis to stop. And they continued attacking that building until finally, around 6 hours later, she was killed. And her colleague narrowly escaped the rubble of the building. And she is haunted by nightmares and isn't willing to do interviews because she says she can't bear to relive those moments. So, that's what I've seen. I've seen the various people who I've met whose family members have been targeted and killed. My videographer, 24-year-old guy named Hussein Farhat, uh, within a week of me arriving here, we went to the south together and filmed some of the rescue workers in a town called Nabatea, and just asking them what it's like to work under Israeli fire every day. 2 days later, I got a message from my videographer. He told me that the Israelis struck my family home and they killed 6 of my family members. None of them were Hezbollah. None of them were affiliated with the resistance. In fact, they were mostly children who died. So 4 of his little cousins, 2 of them were girls between the ages of 11 and 14, 2 little boys aged 2 and 6, I believe. And that's been the experience that I've had here in Lebanon. Is just everyone that I meet, especially from the south, is having their loved ones killed. Israel consistently insists that these people are Hezbollah. I have found nothing to indicate that that's the case. I visited a medical center and rescue headquarters in Mashuk in South Lebanon. The Israelis claimed that this was a Hezbollah command post, much like they claimed that the Al Shifa hospital in Gaza contained a Hamas command post underneath. When I went and looked in the rubble, all I found was destroyed medical equipment. I didn't find any weapons. I didn't find any evidence of any kind of armed activity there. But it is true that many of these facilities, I think largely because the government won't fund them, they do accept funding from, hospitals, schools. They accept funding from Hezbollah. People see them as their legitimate defenders, and they say that these are the people who are stepping up since the Lebanese army refuses to, and they're kind of an integral part of the community. You don't necessarily see them when you're out and about, but it is the dominant political force in southern Lebanon. And again, it's partly because the Lebanese government kind of refuses to go there and serve these people. So someone is stepping up, and that, in this case, is a quote unquote terrorist organization. But they see them as their brothers and fathers and members of their community. It's a guerrilla resistance movement, so you don't necessarily know who's involved and who's not. But they are inextricably intertwined with the community, for sure. But the extent to which any given victim is a Hezbollah member, I mean, these grandmothers and these babies that we see every day dying, I mean, can you really claim with a straight face that they are Hezbollah members? Obviously
Is
not.
that a feature or a bug in your view that, when Israel explains their actions, sometimes they'll say, well, there, as you say, there were fighters there. Well, it happened to be a hospital, but there were fighters in it. Or it's actually a dual purpose command center / hospital, and that's why we had to destroy it. But in your view, are they systematically destroying villages, systematically destroying hospitals, systematically killing the young and the elderly, or is it truly an accident or a byproduct of going after some perceived military target?
No, I think it's pretty clear that they are using the presence of Hezbollah as a fig leaf to justify what they've, if you take their word for it, what they've been wanting to do for since 1948, which is to expand their borders, to create some kind of buffer zone in southern Lebanon, to potentially hand it over to a group of collaborators. Um, the idea that, again, that any of these people, I mean, I freely acknowledge that it is certainly possible that some of these people who are being killed may have some link to the resistance. But really, any significant portion, that I highly doubt. And certainly nowhere near all of them, and especially not, again, the children and the elderly people that they're killing, the entire families that get wiped out. Um, it's it's very clear. And again, this is something that I saw in Iran as well. Um, the MO from the Israelis would be, well, we can find and track one person who we can credibly accuse of being part of, an enemy military force. I visited in Tehran a destroyed apartment building, where the father of this family was a general in the Iranian armed forces. And what Israel did, though, was rather than targeting this man, is that they waited until the first night of Nowruz, which is the Persian New Year. And it's a moment when anybody who knows anything about Iranian culture will know that everyone will be at home with their families. And so this was when they struck at 12:05 a.m. On the first day of Nowruz, knowing that he would be at home with his family. So they killed the entire family. It was 8 or 9 people that were killed in one particular strike. There were babies there. There were elderly women there. Uh, Obviously, none of these people are capable, even if they wanted to, of fighting Israel or anyone else for that matter. But it doesn't really matter to them, And I think honestly, the cruelty is sort of the point. They're trying to in much the same way as when the U.S. Uh, well, they don't. We don't even admit that we did it, but it's very clear to everyone who's paid much attention. The U.S. bombed the Minab elementary school and killed 73 little boys and 47 little girls on the opening day of the U.S. Israeli war on Iran. And you first the narrative was online among kind of the Iranian monarchists and the Israelis was, oh, this was Iranian air defense. This was a misfired Iranian air defense missile. And then obviously Iranian media showed the remnants of this strike, and they showed that this was a Tomahawk missile, and you can find individual parts from this rocket that are obviously, they prove with beyond a doubt that this was a Tomahawk missile strike. And then Donald Trump said, well, Iran has Tomahawk missiles. No, they don't. No one ever said, who would have sold Iran Tomahawk missiles?
Wasn't it a double tap strike? So are they saying the Iranians double tapped themselves? And so, can we talk a little bit about the ethics and the legality to the extent that there's still laws of war? It sounds like there's not, and Israel's leading the way in violating all that. But is it under the laws of war, murdering a general in his home is not something that you do, right? You can kill a general on the battlefield, but you don't follow him home and murder him. That's just not,
And his
or murder
family.
a head of state. That's illegal under Geneva Conventions, isn't it?
Well, so much of what we see is illegal under the Geneva Conventions. I mean, Donald Trump's declaration that an entire civilization will die tonight leads me to believe, and I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is this basically demonstrates genocidal intent, that this would elevate something like the Minab school bombing to a crime against humanity. That it makes it clear that there is an attempt to wipe out in whole or in part an entire ethnic group. When you say an entire civilization will die if they don't do what I want, there's not really a whole lot of room for interpretation there. So, as far as I'm concerned, every one of these war crimes, especially the ones with just mass child casualties, there's a case that these are consistent crimes against humanity, and everyone involved, from my perspective, should be thrown in jail.
Wyatt, I want to transition to Iran, and you mentioned the Minab girls' school, which was struck on the first day of, I think, February 28th of the U.S. and Israel bombing of Iran. And I believe you visited there. I want to ask you about that and some of the other things you saw in Iran. But before we leave Lebanon, could you just talk a little bit about your impressions? Have you been to this country before? You've been here for 2 weeks now. What is your impression? It's supposed to be a beautiful place, mountains, great cuisine, nice people. What have been your impressions of Lebanon? Can you share a little bit about your trip?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful country, and I'd like to go see a little bit more of it as kind of a tourist. Now it's wartime, so it's very clear. Everyone I interact with, they assume I'm either a journalist or I work at the U.S. Embassy, and there's basically no other reason for me as an American to be here. So that's usually what they'll ask. Oh, you're a journalist? Yep, yes, And my impressions, though, is that it's an incredible country. The food is phenomenal. It's just probably one of my favorite countries food wise I've ever been to. Up there with Italy for sure. Just the variety of the food. A lot of it, you can get just really cheap, and yeah, the country itself. Everyone is very nice to me. Even it's I get treated very nicely by basically all parts of society. I haven't met anyone who's been angered by my presence. So and that was my impression also in Iran. Funnily enough, this country that gets a kind of has this reputation of hating all Americans. I would go to pro-government rallies or people are yelling "Marbar America," death to America. And the first time I kind of heard that, I was wondering. I hope that's not directed at me. But while people are chanting this, I'm having kids and their parents come up to me. Oh, you're an American? Oh, I love America. It's not Americans that they dislike. It's our government. It's our foreign policy. It's our deep state elite that no matter who you vote into office are constantly pushing for us to go to war with these countries to control their resources and to control their political process. So people there are more than capable of, and here are more than capable of distinguishing between individually Americans and our government. And I only wish that we in America were able to show them the same grace and the same understanding in terms of differentiating between the people and their government, which clearly is not the case in terms of Israel's action here in Lebanon, and certainly not the case in terms of American actions in Iran.
Can you talk about some of the significant things that you observed in Iran? How did you travel throughout the country? It's a huge country. How did you travel? Just talk a little bit about your investigative reporting from Iran.
Yeah, well, when I arrived in Iran, this was very shortly after they had announced a ceasefire. So there were no planes operating. The skies were shut, and so I had to fly to Turkey, to a kind of a border city named Van, and from there I rode for several hours and crossed by land into Iran. And from there, I went to the city of Tabriz and made my way to the capital city, Tehran. Was able to go south to the city of Isfahan, which is just maybe the most beautiful city I've ever visited. Just an absolute jewel. The architecture is unbelievable. It's probably the prettiest city on earth. And from there, went down south to Bandar Abbas. I was able to see the Strait of Hormuz firsthand, and see what it was like while it's blockaded, and pass by dozens and dozens of oil tankers, cargo ships, and cross nearly to the other side to Oman in a matter of 45 minutes. It's very narrow and very shallow. And then from there, I took a overnight train back up to Tehran. So I was able to see a huge chunk of the country, and very grateful to have been able to make that trip and speak to so many people. Um, I was blown away. As an American, you're certainly told that Iran is kind of this oppressive authoritarian state. If you imagine it in your mind, it's kind of gray, and it's a very very oppressive environment. And it just was not at all what I found to be the case, which was a country like any other where people have a variety of political opinions, dress in varying different ways. Women and girls go out without hijab all the time. And in fact, when I was interviewing the governor of Bandar Abbas at a coffee shop, I I noticed that teenage girls sitting directly behind him were not wearing headscarves at all, and this seemed to be of no concern to them. They clearly were not bothered by the possibility that the governor of their state would say anything to them about it. So you see people living their lives, going about their days as they would in any other country, which is not to say that there aren't some speech restrictions, and I wouldn't describe it as some kind of utopia, but it's a normal country filled with normal people living normal lives, and the vast majority of them just want to continue doing that and go out and find a future partner and have children and go to work, come back home, live their lives. Very few people, it seemed, actually want to be bombed. The only Iranians I ever found who wanted to be bombed were those in the diaspora, the living comfortably in Los Angeles or in Europe. These are the people who were cheering and dancing when the U.S. Obliterated 120 little kids. That was not the reaction in Iran. The reaction in Iran was being horrified and appalled. And ironically, I think before the war there was a significant chunk of the population that would have potentially been supportive of some kind of regime change. Those people, I think, are increasingly marginalized, and fewer. I have not heard or even seen of a single Iranian who was with the government before but is now against. But I have seen dozens and dozens of examples of people who were against the government before but are now with it, because they have come to understand that the option is not some kind of nice liberal democracy. The option is between a somewhat authoritarian government that means self-rule for Iranians, and a highly violent, oppressive foreign occupation led by a man who is threatening to destroy your entire civilization, who doesn't even seem capable of comprehending what that means. As someone who wants to steal all of your natural resources and use it to enrich themselves. That's the option. And as long as that's the option, I think it's no mystery why people in that country tend to be rallying around their government rather than trying to pull it down.
What tell us about you? You did visit the site of that bombing in Minab, the girls' school, where I don't know if it was 150 children were murdered on the first day of bombing. First of all, what were your impressions of what you saw there? And there's been Pat was talking about sort of the ethics of war, and these types of strikes. We just saw one. I think it was this week. A Ukrainian strike of a school in
Lugansk, I believe.
Lugansk. Yes. So there's discussion, people saying that this is possibly a consequence of sort of AI targeting. I don't know if that's something you have a comment on, having visited there, but just talk about your impressions. Take it where you will about being there at a place where it was such a catastrophe.
It is probably the most horrifying thing I've ever reported on. So, I was there with a group of other mostly independent journalists. And it was a heavy day. Even when we woke up, we kind of knew, okay, this is going to be rough. But I don't think anything really could have prepared me for just how rough that would be. We first met with parents of a little girl who was killed that day, February 28th, I believe. And I remember at one point I had to leave the room. I had to go stand outside, and because I couldn't, I lost it. It was just so horrifying to me to have to experience 1/100th of what those parents went through. So interestingly, I found a hand on my shoulder and looked up, and it was a Muslim mom who was comforting me. Somebody who I think we would describe as a mullah, and describe disparagingly in that way, but a sheikh. And we had a very heartfelt conversation. He said that he was surprised that an American was so moved by this, and that he wasn't sure that there were Americans that cared so deeply for people in other countries. And we had kind of a heartfelt conversation. And I was kind of surprised that the quote unquote mullahs in Iran were so gracious and giving with their comfort and with their wisdom. Obviously, just one example, so not to paint with a broad brush. But then we moved to the cemetery where these children were buried. It's the entirely new cemetery because they had nowhere to put all of these little children who were killed. The final death toll was either 155 or 156. One of the victims was pregnant, so that total of 156 includes a teacher who also lost a child when she was killed. 120 of the victims, this is according to Iranian media, this was the final tally that I heard, 120 children, 73 boys and 47 girls. And at the cemetery, we spoke with a mother and father who lost both of their children, Mehdi and Rehana, I believe were their names. And so we talked to these parents who just had this huge void. You could tell was just, they were talking, but this tremendous sadness in their eyes. And after we spoke, I captured, and I have a report on this that I would encourage audience members to view later, about my time in Minab. And I captured footage of this mother down on her knees, caressing this gravestone of her daughter, laying her head down and just gently wiping her hand along this gravestone, and clearly wishing more than anything that she could have her daughter back. And then she picks herself up, she turns around, and she has to do it all over again at her son's grave. And it was just a moment where nothing I can say or do will give any real level of comfort to someone who's going through that. You know, it was one of the saddest days of my life. Just the incomprehensible horror what has been done to these people. Their lives are over. Their lives as they knew them are effectively over, and now they are spending the rest of their lives living in a shadow of their former experience. And it's not something I would wish on my worst enemy, what's been done to those families, 100+ families that are just shattered forever. And that's the reality of American foreign policy. That's what our government does to those people. And there is I've seen claims that this was somehow an AI-based accident. I'm not sure to what extent I believe that. Somebody pushed a button, and somebody pushed it twice. In the aftermath of the first strike, a lot of teachers had gathered. Many of the surviving students were assembled in what remained of the school, hoping to avoid any harm in case another attack came somewhere nearby. And instead, that proved to be the worst decision that they could have made, trying to shelter in place, because less than half an hour later, the U.S. followed up with a second strike. And my understanding, as it's been explained to me, is that Tomahawk missiles feature a setting in which the remaining fuel that has been unused in their flight trajectory is dispersed at the last moment and effectively turns it into a thermobaric bomb. Makes the explosion that much more powerful. And so when we pulled up, you could see the ashes, the soot outside the windowsills, from where this massive explosion had gone off with such force that it left this black imprint on all the windows, below the windows outside, where you could just see this was a massive fireball that exploded throughout the entire building and incinerated everyone inside. And I spoke with an older gentleman who I saw standing at one of the graves, speaking to himself under his breath. And we gave each other a hug, and he didn't speak any English, and my Farsi is terrible, but someone translated for us, and he explained that he had been one of the first people on the scene, and he was picking through the rubble, hoping to find a living child. But the only thing that he found were little tiny hands and disembodied feet from these kids, and that was all that was left of them. And again, so whether AI was involved or wasn't involved, human beings pressed buttons, and they were told to do that by other human beings, and every one of them should be court-martialed. But instead, we have no accountability, not one word from the U.S. government. There's reportedly been an internal report which found that the U.S. government was to blame. We only know about this because it's been leaked to a handful of newspapers, but it's been buried. It's been 3 months since this happened, and not one word. The report that found U.S. fault has been hidden from public view. Maybe we'll never even see it. Instead, we just have silence, and we have lectures and moralizing from people like Marco Rubio accusing Iran of being a terrorist state, while they refuse to acknowledge having obliterated over 100 little children on the first day of their supposedly liberatory war.
Well, Wyatt, I know we're kept you for an hour, so thank you so much for coming and for the work that you're doing, bringing us a firsthand account from Lebanon and Iran. It's invaluable to our listeners, and we really appreciate it. Could you tell everyone how to find your work and support your work?
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure hopping on with you guys. Hopefully, next time I'll have something a little bit more optimistic to discuss. But for those who want to follow along with my work, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Wyatt Reed 13. And you can find me on Substack. It's Wyatt Reed on Substack, and End of Empire on Substack. And I think I'm also on Telegram. But most of my work is published at the Grayzone. So you can also find the Grayzone's Twitter, Grayzone Substack, thegrayzone.com, and on our YouTube page. We've been publishing a lot of reports that I mentioned, and then that interview with the senior Hezbollah official we published yesterday. That may be of interest to some viewers as well.
Well, Wyatt, I'd just like to thank you for all you're doing. You know, back in the day, it used to be when we're in a conflict with a country, there was always interviews from people from the corporate media about our so-called adversaries, and even Dan Rather got his chops doing that in Vietnam, is going and seeing the battle firsthand. And at some point along the way, that's become borderline treasonous to talk to people with whom we're in conflict, as if to understand their motivations or what they think about anything is a crime, really, almost a crime, right? I mean, it was interesting that there was a debate recently where a senior government official, Victoria Nuland, wanted everyone to acknowledge that Vladimir Putin is a monster. And if you don't acknowledge that he's a monster, then you must somehow be complicit in being an enemy of the country. It was just a very strange worldview and a strange way of thinking, but that's where we are right now. And it's only people like you who allow normal people to come to their own conclusions about things by getting the facts firsthand from people who are actually there. So appreciate you doing that, because it's very important to keep that torch alive of understanding the world
I
as
think I
not
think
just.
we have to. I think we have to at least understand what these people think, genuinely think. Let's not, if we're going to go to war, let's not go to war with a caricature. Let's go to war with these people as they actually are. Unfortunately, I think many in the ruling class and in the establishment media understand that if you actually are allowed to hear from these people yourself, you'll be much less willing to send your sons and daughters to go and die to kill them. So, knowing that, I think they go out of their ways to prevent us from hearing from these people, to prevent us from understanding or from viewing anything that might humanize them. Which is why I'm very glad to be able to do what I'm doing, and let Americans and people in the West decide for themselves whether they really think we should be out fighting these people.
Thank
Well,
you again, Wyatt. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on Apple and all the other platforms that we're available on, including YouTube and all of the others. So thank you again, Wyatt, and we'll
thanks.
hope to have you back as this develops.
Be safe.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank you.